Alright, we're finally doing an Overwatch video again so I can give people a break from visual novels, and this one's going to be about a topic that I've wanted to cover for ages, but just have always put off because it never felt like it was especially urgent. After all, Overwatch 2 has moved 5v5, and given the lack of PvE, they're already really struggling to beat the allegations that Overwatch 2 is basically just an excuse to swap to a more consistent, less controversial monetization style, so they'd presumably want to stick with it. For the last 2 years, Blizzard has been understandably pretty quiet on the subject of the 6v6 versus 5v5 debate, since it's one that they can't really win no matter what they do. And so the original plan had been to make this video in August, because I figured then I'd have some time for it. But then, on June 28th, Overwatch's game director Aaron Keller put out a director's take talking about the state of the tank role in Overwatch primarily, and then followed it up with a tweet saying, "My last post spurred a lot of talk around 6v6. We recognize that this is an important topic for many people, including us, and would like to jump into the conversation to share our POV. Look for more on this in the next director's take or possibly dev update." So now, suddenly, this isn't just a nebulous topic that's bubbling below the surface. Feels like Blizzard is genuinely going to acknowledge discourse that's been going on basically ever since the announcement of the changeover to 5v5 years ago at this point. And look, I've seen a lot of arguments about this on both sides of the debate, because even though I'm basically only an Overwatch content creator in theory at this point, I have been keeping up with this one a fair bit. And in a rare instance of me being a bit of a centrist, I think that both sides do have some kind of valid points here. Balancing the tank rule for 5v5 in particular has pretty obviously not been working out, with the most recent patch seeming to affirm more than anything to the general player base that Blizzard's kinda lost the plot here. But 6v6 also did have a litany of issues that wouldn't magically disappear after a couple of years of 5v5. I do think you can make a compelling argument for both sides here, and I don't think that there's an objectively correct argument, and I'll go into that a little bit more later, I guess. However, I do think that this is a debate that's colored more by nostalgia than anything else. Overwatch is nearly a decade old at this point, and as someone who's been playing since day one of Overwatch 1, it's a little crazy to me to remember the old days of this game and think that there are people making like fan cams on TikTok of the early seasons of the game. And this isn't unique to Overwatch. Every game that reaches a certain age will have some sort of a movement like this that begs devs to reject modernity and embrace tradition, to shed the changes that have sullied a pure and good game and bring us back to the golden age, the most famous of those probably being the WoW Classic movement. So that's what I want to talk about today. How the debate over 5v5 and 6v6 is being skewed by nostalgia, perceived through rose-colored glasses, and ultimately isn't being helped by content creators who serve to profit off of this whole debate being inflamed as much as possible. And just to really hammer home the nostalgia of it all, and also so I don't have to play this patch, I'm going to be using some old gameplay footage from Overwatch 1 in the background from my old channel so that people can actually see what the game was like back then. And if you played Overwatch back then, I hope you enjoy this trip down memory lane. Anyways, on with the video. Part 1. The nostalgia. Nostalgia is a pretty powerful force no matter what context we're talking about, and I think it's impossible to separate that from this debate. It's very easy to romanticize the past and wish that we could return to that, especially because Overwatch's golden age really was in its first couple of years in a lot of ways. The end of that golden age is disputed. Different people will say it fell off at different points, and the community has repeatedly moved the goalposts over the time here. Again, I've been here since day one, and I was a content creator for a good couple of years during those so-called golden years. There were people who were convinced a year out from launch that the game had irreparably fallen off by that point, and as time has gone on, they've moved the fallout point to the release dates of different heroes, the beginning of different metas, etc. Moth meta was a big end of the golden age moment for a lot of people that I recall, as was Brigitte's introduction, as was the dominance of goats. More recently though, it seems like the consensus has begun to form around the beginning of the content drought, a period of time starting after the release of Echo in early 2020 that saw very little in the way of new content because Blizzard was supposedly going full throttle on Overwatch 2. Now, when we're talking about nostalgia, I think it is important to recognize that Overwatch is a pretty old game by this point. Like, I was 18 or about to turn 18 when the game came out, and I'm now 26. When I bought Overwatch 1, I was just about to graduate high school, I was about to start my gap year, and I had just been accepted into university. Things were going pretty good for me, and I had a lot to look forward to. Also, just kinda in general, in hindsight, it seems pretty clear that 2016 and 2017 were some pretty major turnover years with a lot of massive changes to the status quo, especially in a lot of the places where Overwatch was big. You know, politically, 2016 saw the victory of Brexit in the UK, the elections of people like Trump in America and Duterte in the Philippines, as well as impeachments in both Brazil of President Rousseff and South Korea of President Park. As an Albertan, the changeover kinda already began in 2015 when we watched a 44-year political dynasty collapse out of nowhere in favor of the Alberta NDP, the first left-of-center government since at least 1935, followed by a federal election at the end of the year that saw Justin Trudeau's Liberals unseat Stephen Harper's Conservatives after nearly a decade of power. For a lot of people, it felt like that sort of 2015, 2016, 2017 period was either the beginning of a period of serious chaos or the last years of normal before it all went to shit, depending on where you're at, because even if you were on the side that was getting what you wanted politically, everyone was just suddenly extremely hostile. Family gatherings became way more contentious. People were losing friends because they realized that they suddenly had pretty severe political differences. And for a lot of people, it was a moment of mass realization that we're not really playing for the same team here. On the flip side, if you were an Overwatch fan, you were being fed like crazy in 2016 in particular. There were all these amazing new cinematics coming out. There was a ton of hype. The game was going mainstream. Like, it was pretty wild. Being there in the early days of Overwatch felt like you got in at day one of a major cultural phenomenon in a lot of ways. It was like being there for the beginning of Beatlemania or seeing the first Star Wars movie in theaters. And then right after launch, we got the Summer Games, we got Ana, we got the Sombra ARG, followed by the insanely hyped Sombra launch at BlizzCon 2016. Again, I can't really overstate how incredible that was. We got Halloween Terror, we got more cinematics, we got Winter Wonderland. Like, things were going really good. There was the announcement of the Overwatch League and the Path to Pro as well, which felt like Overwatch not only had the cultural pull as a casual game, but as a serious esport that could take the scene to new heights, especially in like the mainstream of things. And then, over time, things faded. It felt like new heroes just got more and more contentious over time, especially with Brigitte, who upended a lot of the game's meta. New maps were also contentious, particularly when they were for 2CP, with Horizon Lunar Colony and Paris being the most obvious ones. It felt like the good old days of Overwatch were already starting to fall behind it, that its best times were in the past. But obviously, none of this happened in a bubble. I genuinely think a lot of people look back on early Overwatch, especially that first year, as positively as they do because of nostalgia more than anything in a lot of ways, and not just nostalgia for the game itself. Overwatch's target audience then, and still now to some extent, were a lot of young adults, sort of like the 18 to 25 range, and even if you were a few years older or a few years younger, you have almost certainly entered into a more stressful period of life between the day that Overwatch 1 came out and the present day. If you, like me, were big on Overwatch during that first year, it kind of felt like a big last hurrah before everything went to shit, including Overwatch, it seemed like. However, it's important to remember that this doesn't mean that 6v6 is the answer to the problems we're facing today for a couple key reasons. For one, Overwatch 1 in 2016 is a fundamentally different game than Overwatch 2 in 2024. It's not just 5v5 versus 6v6, which feels like what a lot of the debate gets oversimplified down to these days. The Overwatch roster has doubled since launch, and even while Overwatch 1 was still active, the new heroes had created problems within 6v6 that had to be addressed. As Ana, Sombra, Orisa, Doomfist, Moira, Brigitte, Wrecking Ball, Ashe, Baptiste, Sigma, and Echo were added to the game changed. And a lot of people would argue it was not always for the better, or at least not always in ways that kept it recognizable with what it used to be. I made an old video about like Overwatch is the ship of Theseus in terms of how things have changed, and if it's still the same game, you can check that out at the card up above. But anyways, we had some really bad metas, we had some really broken heroes, and we had some really frustrating maps and modes. Things like hero limits and role queue were introduced to try and mitigate some of the worst of it, but obviously those didn't fix everything either. It's also important to remember that the beginning of the content drought pretty neatly coincides with the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that people became nostalgic for the pre-pandemic era of Overwatch as time went on, for a lot of the same reasons that they became nostalgic for the first year or so of Overwatch 1 before the pandemic. Everything sucks now. It somehow managed to become even more divisive, everything has gotten worse, and then Overwatch 2 came out right as the pandemic was seemingly coming to an end, that it felt like we could go back to normal. And it wasn't a cultural phenomenon. It didn't bring back that spark from 2016. It was just another sequel. It felt like the game didn't work as well as it was supposed to. A lot of promises were broken, again, most notably around PvE, and it turned out that the end of the pandemic didn't mean that everything went back to normal either. People didn't suddenly get along. A lot of bells were rung that can't be unrung. Not everyone's going to agree on when Overwatch was the best in terms of balance, but I think people were enjoying the game and enjoying life more in the past. Recessions and political instability and social chaos have coincided with Overwatch aging as a game and its player base aging into the world more. People wish that they were able to like Overwatch more, and they were having more fun playing Overwatch back in 2016 during the early days of Overwatch 1 and then pre-pandemic than they have been during the lifetime of Overwatch 2 for a variety of reasons relating to the game as well as just life as a whole. So it's understandable that they want to change something to try and make the game fun again. And look, like I said, people had these arguments back during Overwatch 1 too, and one of the bigger pushes in the reject modernity, embrace tradition camp was an end to either hero limits or role queue as a whole. However, people didn't really get as on board with that. The memory of 5 DPS and 1 tank was still too fresh, and even if there was a lot of nostalgia for the golden era, I don't think people could really agree on what made that era so good. There were just too many things that changed over that period. It was a death by 1,000 razors of the golden age. When it comes to Overwatch 2 though, it's a lot easier to identify one major difference between the games that does legitimately affect how it plays pretty significantly: the move to 5v5. And look, a lot of people have good arguments for going back to 6v6. I am not saying that they don't, but I am saying that I think a lot of people involved in the argument aren't really reckoning with how their nostalgia is skewing their perspective on this. Going back to 6v6 doesn't mean that we magically go back to some pre-pandemic era of the game any more than going back to no hero limits and no role queue with just the original 21 heroes would have meant going back to like the pre-Trump era or whatever. Nostalgia is a powerful drug, but it's not like it's just nostalgia at play here. Not everyone was there for the early days of Overwatch. Not everyone was a day one Overwatch fan. And I think that's where we have to get into a bit of a bigger discussion. Part 2. Rose-colored glasses. You didn't have to experience Overwatch 1 for yourself to know that it was a cultural phenomenon. And more importantly, you don't have to have been there to still see what it played like. There are millions and millions of hours of gameplay footage of Overwatch 1 out there, not to mention countless content creators and just general Overwatch players who can tell you what the experience was like. And it's really easy to get it in your mind that 2016 to 2020 was just an objectively better experience of Overwatch, and that a return to 6v6 would be a good step towards returning us to that. However, it's important to remember that time is a pretty great filter here. People want to look back nostalgically on the past, but even beyond that, we just tend to filter out the garbage that sucked. Think about how we talk about music. Like, you think of the 60s, you think of the Beatles, but obviously there wasn't just the Beatles. And plenty of the non-Beatles stuff was dog shit, just like plenty of music played today is dog shit. However, if you go listen to a 60s station on the radio or a 60s playlist on Spotify, you're getting a decade's worth of the best with all that garbage that inexplicably fills the charts filtered out. We've seen it happen with every decade of music. Like, we're even starting to see it happen more and more with the 2010s, a decade that I was gonna say still barely out of, but like, we're kind of a fair ways out now. But why? Well, obviously there's nostalgia, just like with Overwatch and 6v6. Something pretty notable for pop music in particular is that 2017 was also a massive changeover year for them. As Todd in the Shadows put it in his Train Records video about Katy Perry's Witness, 2017 was a pretty serious changeover year in pop, from the bubblegum pop of Katy Perry to the slow burn minor key artists that emerged like Halsey or 21 Pilots. It was a changeover that I'd argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, probably really began with Lorde in 2013, but 2017 was when the big change happened there too. And so there's nostalgia for the 2016 and prior music for a lot of the same reasons that there's nostalgia for early Overwatch. More to the point though, is that a lot of 2010's music was terrible. Most of you watching this probably lived through it, you know that, and even if you liked a lot of it, like I did, there was still a lot of garbage. And yet, you could easily put together a playlist of banger after banger from the decade, both pre and post 2017, and from whichever genre you really wanted. Some of the best songs from artists like Katy Perry, Adele, Lorde, Kesha, Taylor Swift, and Rihanna came out during the 2010s. Hell, if you like pop music, you could pretty much just put every #1 Billboard single from the decade on a playlist and, aside from some obvious exceptions like Harlem Shake or All About That Bass, have a pretty solid playlist. Obviously, only going for #1s filters out a ton of terrible music, and not even all of it. Again, All About That Bass would still make that playlist, but it would filter out a lot of it. Looking back on an entire decade at large makes it a lot easier to only ever have to acknowledge the hits. Only looking at the #1 means that you're not looking at the other 99 tracks on the top 100, much less the thousands of songs that never even made it onto the charts. And this is true of every decade in music. There is no perfect run of amazing music through any decade. It's just that once the decade is over and you can put a stopper on it, you can clean out the dreck and end up with a really solid track list. The same thing happens with Overwatch. If you were there back then, nostalgia does a lot to clean up your memory. But even if you weren't there, if you ever try and look back on what happened, you're gonna end up finding footage of the best moments. Like, you're finding the equivalent of the #1 singles. No one's preserving their millionth infuriating stalled to a draw match on Horizon, and nobody's going back to watch that shit either. You're also not likely to go back and watch the discourse videos of that era either, because they're just outdated. Who gives a shit if your Overwatch put out a Sombras of Support video in 2017 or 2018 or whenever the hell that was? Why would you go watch that now? Sombra has been reworked a half dozen times since then anyways, so the argument wouldn't even make much sense to you anymore. Like, what would you do with that information? And so, you kind of just paper over how much discourse there was. If you're ever trying to learn about past Overwatch, you're either trying to learn about it from patch notes and wikis where you don't get the context of what it was actually like to experience, or you're going through old videos and VODs from the era to see what the gameplay was like without realizing just how curated that is. People don't save their worst games, they save their highlights. Like, if you've been paying attention to the background footage, this is Overwatch 1 footage too. Like I said, this is from my original channel back around 2017, 2018, and I was, recording, editing, uploading these games, and I was only really picking the ones that I was proud of, the ones where I felt like if I put it on my channel, I wasn't embarrassing myself. So of course, these are going to be the games that make it look good, especially from my personal perspective, or at least decently good. Look, I was never that good at Overwatch. Let's not pretend that that's why any of us are here. It also kind of doesn't help that a lot of the big names of Overwatch back in the day fell away from the game over time. And the people who stuck around are the ones who were able to keep finding success here, meaning their experience with the game is buoyed either by competitive successes, personal successes, or the way that it makes you like a game more when it pays your bills. Like, I speak from experience here. I like Inescapable a lot more now that it's paid my mortgage for the last few months, and I'd probably like Overwatch a lot more too if I could, pay bills with this game. Anyways, the point is that all of this creates the perfect conditions to look at the game with rose-colored glasses, and to forget the game had a lot of flaws throughout its lifetime that would still affect Overwatch if we ever went back to 6v6. As much as, Overwatch TikTok wants to pretend that the era of Jeff Kaplan was truly, the time to be playing this game, they kind of are ignoring the fact that people did not like a lot of what Jeff Kaplan did when the game was being run by him. There were a lot of poor decisions made during that period. Dan Olsen's video on the push for WoW Classic is really insightful into how this kind of nostalgia plays out for a game's community, particularly when they start to get their way. One of the points that he brings up is that over the course of a game's lifetime, there are a lot of little changes that happen that you've just gotten used to and don't even think about. And it's worth remembering how true that is of Overwatch. I mean, for one, like there's the big stuff. We don't have 2CP anymore, and I don't think people really remember how infuriating that shit was. People were begging for 2CP to be removed pretty much from day one. Hell, every time we got a new 2CP map, everyone was basically just groaning and rolling their eyes. Also, I know it's obvious that we have more heroes now, but it's really just hard to grasp how much things have changed because of that, and how much the original 21 have changed since then too. There are entire playstyles right now that just straight up did not exist back then, either because the heroes that enabled them didn't exist, or because the heroes that enabled them hadn't been balanced for it yet. Crucially, people were also just way worse at Overwatch back then. It was easier to be good. Right now, you can't play Overwatch without playing against at least some people who've likely been playing it for close to a decade. But back then, you used to be able to just rock up with Widowmaker and click on heads for hours because people would just walk in straight lines towards you with no AD spam or barriers or anything. Part of why 6v6 became so stagnant back in the day wasn't because 6v6 was a worse format, but because people just had time to fully figure out how to play it. Back in 2016, everyone was new, which made it feel easier to get into and made it kind of feel more fun. There wasn't as much of a meta for the casual players, people were just sort of enjoying themselves and playing the game. But over time that changed. It became harder for new casual players to get into it because the casual players who'd been there since day one had just learned more about the game and were way better at it in a way that you can't really overcome without also investing a lot of hours into it. Plus, people were just excited about Overwatch back then. They were willing to let a lot of shit slide. There were new cinematics coming out constantly, the cosmetics felt new and exciting, and we hadn't all burnt out on loot boxes yet, and we didn't know about all the horrifying shit going on behind the scenes at Blizzard. Like, for some people, I think it's hard to imagine Blizzard as a company that, like, everyone really was willing to give the benefit of the doubt to, but, like, back then they were. That was the era of, like, it'll be out when it's ready type of mentality from Blizzard, where Overwatch was meant to be, like, this big game changer, and it felt like it was going to be. It felt like they were really committed to that. As a result, people were willing to kind of let that shit slide. And again, time has just passed. People remember, or at least know of, mass res in theory, but even if you did experience it, it's been close to a decade since you last experienced it. Your memory is overwhelmed by Valkyrie era Mercy and the frustrations or joys that you attach to that, and mass res just fades into the background. Nobody wants that back, but that was part of 6v6 too, at least in the early days. People hate what Kiriko's done to the game, and I can understand some of their arguments, but when they use her impact as part of the argument that we need to return to the old days, like, I really feel like they don't remember how much damage Brigitte did to the health of the game. Or at least it's become softer in their memories because they're, again, aging and looking back at the past with rose-colored glasses. And to be clear, I'm not saying that you're bad or a dumb person if you do have rose-colored glasses. That's human. That's how we are. However, I do think it's important to acknowledge that this doesn't exist in an individualized, isolated bubble. There's someone putting their finger on the scale here. Or, to be more accurate, a whole bunch of people putting a whole bunch of fingers on it. Part 3. The Influencers. One of the reasons why I don't make exclusively Overwatch content like I used to, especially now, is because there's only so much you can say about a single game. I've maintained a mostly bi-weekly release schedule for the last 21-ish months of my life, meaning that I've made about 52 video essays depending on which ones you include. 37 or so of those videos have been about Overwatch directly, and I remember telling people back in 2023 when I did the debut as a VTuber that part of the reason why I was making the change to start making more non-Overwatch topics was because I could tell I was starting to run out of things to say about Overwatch, and I wanted to expand my range, both to avoid burnout and to avoid having to scrape the bottom of the barrel for content ideas. And remember, I'm only doing one video every 2 weeks, and I was still starting to run out of ideas. Some of these content creators have weekly release schedules or even release content multiple times a week. Some of them are even putting out daily content, and I pretty strongly believe that daily content that isn't just like pure gameplay stuff is a sacrifice of all quality in favor of pure quantity. Nobody has 20 minutes worth of things to say every single day about the same topic. They just don't. Regardless, there are a lot of people who exclusively make Overwatch content, whether it's because they just love Overwatch that much or because every time they try and step away from it, their audience doesn't follow. And again, trust me, I know how that feels. Last year I put out a few non-Overwatch videos about the Clue movie, about Quantum Redshift, and about Spike Chunsoft games to help kind of feel out what the vibe was. And up until April of this year when the Inescapable video came along and accidentally boosted the Spike Chunsoft video, all three of them sat at the very bottom in terms of performance on my channel. Even now, those other two videos, the Clue one and the Quantum Redshift one, have been joined by the videos I've made about Buried Stars, Fusion Frenzy, and the genres that gaming struggles with, while the Overwatch videos still typically just perform better than them. However, this creates a set of incentives that lead to some not great outcomes for a lot of these creators that look something like this. Incentive 1. I'm making a living off of my content, meaning that I am incentivized to make whatever content will get enough engagement to make a steady income. Incentive 2. YouTube prioritizes channels with consistent frequent uploads, meaning that I am incentivized to make whatever content I can produce quickly. Incentive 3. People are way more likely to engage with a video if the subject is something that they are angry about or agitated about, and I'm taking their side, meaning that I am incentivized to make content that will rile up the audience and place me firmly on their side in a conflict. If a conflict does not exist, then I am incentivized to invent one to take their side in. Incentive 4. YouTube heavily prioritizes metrics like watch time and the click-through rate in terms of whether or not it'll recommend your stuff to other viewers, meaning that I am incentivized to create content with clickbaitable titles and thumbnails that are as long as possible to maximize my CTR and my watch time. I am also incentivized to make videos that are at least 10 minutes long so I can place mid-roll ads, and the longer it is, the more I can place. Now, these aren't all inherently negative incentives, and some of them are kind of just unavoidable because of the nature of it, but collectively, they do have a lot of negative consequences. When content becomes your livelihood, you don't get the luxury of only making what you want to make. You kind of got to do what the platform wants from you and what your audience wants from you. When you're rewarded for uploading a lot of content frequently and consistently, you're incentivized to get sloppy and just say whatever, even if you haven't really thought about it much. When you're rewarded for clickbait, rage bait, and farming conflict, then you're never incentivized to take a level-headed approach. You're incentivized to rile people up even more so that you can keep making videos on the subject that they'll keep coming back to watch. The emphasis on click-through rate and watch time means that you're incentivized to make big promises with the title and thumbnail, even if, for the previously stated reasons, you're incentivized to also make lazier, sloppier content. And since watch time is prioritized, you've also got to stretch it out for like at least 10 minutes, but realistically you're aiming for more like 20 to 30. You know, long enough for someone to watch it while they're eating a meal, or to listen to it in the car like it's a podcast, or to put it on while they're doing their morning/evening routine. And of course, put 3 or 4 mid-rolls in there. Ideally, you'd make even longer content, like, I don't know, 100 to 170 minutes, give or take, since that seems to be what YouTube wants from maybe some creators, hypothetically, of course. It gives you a lot of room for mid-rolls, but it also just logistically isn't feasible if you're doing daily uploads, or even just more than like one every week or two. Over time, we all run out of valuable things to say about a single topic, particularly if it's one that just doesn't ultimately do that much over time. Imagine if you had to write a 2,000-word essay about Overwatch every single day for years. Like, we're not even talking about presenting it. We're not talking about recording, editing, uploading, none of that. We're just talking about, imagine if you had to sit down at your computer every morning, try to type out 2,000 words worth of things worth saying. Or hell, let's be charitable and say it's just once a week you have to do that. Do you think you'd be able to keep coming up with things worth actually saying for very long? No, of course not. You also probably wouldn't have the energy for like deep dives into particularly interesting topics, and you certainly would often fall back on easier stuff just because you need to meet a deadline, especially if you have sponsors. You want to pick something that's simple, straightforward, and clear. Something like 6v6 versus 5v5, because that's easy to fit into a title or a thumbnail for good clickbait. For a game that's as old as Overwatch that's clearly seen better days in terms of its popularity and public perception at a bare minimum, nostalgia bait content is an obvious answer. Get mad at Blizzard for making a change, point to when it was better in the past, gloss over the flaws of the past that might get in the way of your argument, ramble for 45 minutes unscripted before sending it to your editor to turn into 3 videos across 2 of your channels plus 8 or so YouTube shorts or TikToks. Rinse and repeat, cash out at the end of the month. Now, to state the obvious, individuals would obviously still experience nostalgia and experience rose-colored glasses for Overwatch even without the influencers. I don't think there's any way to reasonably dispute that, and I'm not trying to. And again, I also don't think that means that the argument for or against 6v6 or 5v5 is inherently flawed. I do, however, think that they both color the debate, and I think influencers have figured out that they stand to benefit pretty massively from exacerbating the debate. And, crucially, this brings me to another incentive that I didn't really mention before. Incentive 5. People will watch you fight the battle for as long as the battle continues. Meaning that you are incentivized to do everything you can to keep the fight going without it ever being resolved. Especially because if you're arguing for change, you risk it going poorly if you ever actually win. This is an incentive that exists anywhere where you can pick sides in a fight. An obvious example is in American politics. Republicans benefited a lot from Roe v. Wade being the law of the land, because it meant that they could build a base out of it, fundraise off of it, and get people to overlook a lot of other policy points because they agreed so strongly with them on it. On the flip side, there were also a lot of people who looked at the Republicans and thought, yeah, they oppose Roe v. Wade and I support it, but given its popularity, surely they won't really overturn it and risk the backlash, they're just using it for campaigning. But then Republican-appointed justices overturned Roe v. Wade, and suddenly it's no longer just theoretical. They won the battle, and a lot of people turned on them because they didn't actually want it to be overturned. What's more, a lot of the people who did support overturning Roe suddenly just don't really have as much of a clear reason to throw buckets of money at Republicans. They got what they wanted, the fight has ended, and it's going to stay ended because of the Supreme Court's supermajority of conservatives, so why keep burning money on a fight you've already won? On the flip side, you have something like Obergefell v. Hodges, which codified same-sex marriage in the US. There were a lot of people who mobilized to legalize it nationally in the States, as they had done in Canada a decade earlier and in many other countries before and since. But once the decision was handed down, a lot of that mobilization disappeared, even though plenty of other issues affecting queer people were still very much so not settled. Part of the reason why so much of the gay rights push in the 2000s and 2010s revolved around marriage was because gay marriage is something that's easy to communicate. It's a simple concept, it has a simple name, it is something that's very easy for everyone to understand what we're talking about, and the end goal of a movement in favor of same-sex marriage is one that can be concrete. Rallying people around the rights of same-sex couples in adoption procedures, or rights around things like medical visitations or inheritance, or more nuanced issues like ending discrimination on the basis of gender and sexuality in instances like services, housing, and hate speech is just harder. People got more fragmented. Cis queer men and women who are otherwise privileged in terms of race, class, ability, etc. tended to kind of split away a bit more from the more marginalized parts of the community and stopped fighting for those causes once they got what they wanted. Everyone could rally around gay marriage as a first step, but that didn't guarantee that everyone would give a shit about taking the next step after that. Same goes for the Roe v. Wade situation. A lot of people united behind Republicans before that was overturned, but for a variety of reasons, a lot of that base fragmented and isn't as unified after it. Bringing it back to 5v5 versus 6v6, most influencers, smart ones anyways, are mostly hoping that we never actually go back to 6v6. I mean, they'll argue in favor of it because it rallies an audience and it gets them paid, and it's an easy topic to always tie back into pretty much anything else you want to talk about, but they really don't ever want it to win. They'll pull on your nostalgia, they'll give you the rose-colored glasses, and they'll whip you up into a frenzy about it, but I think when Aaron tweeted that they were going to actually start talking about it, a lot of them got scared that this might be the end of the run. If Overwatch ever goes back to 6v6, the best case scenarios for those creators who have built so much of an identity and an audience and a viewer base around that is that everyone loves the change, they think that they were smart and correct, but they no longer have any 6v6 versus 5v5 content to publish without having to flip-flop and pick the other side and alienate the people who thought they were right, which would hurt their views. The worst case scenario is that Blizzard changes it back to 6v6, it goes abysmally, everyone clowns on the influencers for being dumb and wrong about it, and then it eventually just goes back to 5v5 anyways. The ideal strategy for the influencers then is to never give you good arguments that could realistically convince the devs if they ever picked up steam. The goal is to rely on nostalgia and those rose-colored glasses because that way you get heated about it and you are emotionally invested, and so you keep engaging with their content about it. But Blizzard can pretty easily ignore it because it's all just arguments based on emotion and nostalgia rather than actual concrete information and anything factual. The problem for those influencers then is that not everyone understands the game they're trying to play, and some of them are doing too good of a job making real arguments here. And now that Blizzard's truly getting a little bit desperate, again, there's layoffs, there's all this shit going on, their PR is not doing too hot, they might be willing to listen to some of those real arguments and just pray that 6v6 works out for them. Once again, to be clear, I would like Overwatch to be good. If you really want my opinion on the debate, I think 6v6 was fatally flawed for a lot of reasons that would need to be fixed if we were ever going to go back to it, and I don't have faith that Blizzard is capable of doing that, particularly in the current era post-Microsoft acquisition and the massive layoffs. However, 5v5 is also clearly fatally flawed, most notably when it comes to the tanks and their role in the game. At this point, I don't personally think that either is inherently better. I haven't heard an argument that sways me really in either direction, but I do think that it's better not to abandon the devil we know for the devil we don't. Maybe one day I'll make a video fully expressing my perspective on the actual debate of 5v5 versus 6v6. I mean, like I said, I've got bills to pay too. Everyone else is cashing in, why can't I? But I think the more important thing here is to recognize how much of this debate is being driven by factors that don't actually matter. Nostalgia isn't a sign that you're dumb, but it is not helpful when the debate is about a rule change for a game. We should be looking at the discussion with clear eyes, not just going like, oh my god, that's so true, influencer. Overwatch really was better back in 2016. Blizzard, hire this man. At the influencers who have so many incentives to derail and muddy the debate. Whichever side wins here, it will not be a unanimous victory, nor will there be consensus about whether or not the right side won. And it's important to not let influencers whip you up into such a frenzy that you become incapable of enjoying the game unless the influencers win an argument that they have every incentive to drag out forever and never actually finish either way.
Got 3 of them, or 2 of them. Nice.
Good work.
I got Thorana.
Watch out for the Baron. Watch out for the Baron.
And that's where I'm going to end this one. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that other stuff the algorithm likes. If you haven't already, you should check out the video I did about Overwatch's original sin and comparing it to games like Marvel Rivals and Supervive from a couple weeks ago. Or you could check out the most recent video I put out about how the death game visual novel Your Turn to Die makes choices count. Both of those will be on the end screen in a second. The members have chosen time loops, roguelikes, and how genres blend as the next video topic, so that'll be coming out in a couple weeks. Each month, my channel members pick one video topic for me to make, and if you'd like to join them to choose next month's video, you can become a member for $5 a month by clicking the join button below. The poll is going to start on August 1st, and the topics will be, what is Overwatch supposed to be? you stagnating in competitive isn't Blizzard's fault, why listen to the players doesn't work, hero bans aren't the solution, and a defensive V3. Last thing before we go, thank you to all my channel members. Mini Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Dextiny, Yoshi of the Wire, Catlover192, Sourdough, Aluma Riley, Cadence, Windex the Great, V, Deleathers, Gavoss, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Jules Coolness, Cactine Kushler, Iacri, Hallucigeno, MV, The Only Enigma, Hazmat Bad at Games, Mariah, and Amon Dadley. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.